My window says meeting is now streaming live on Facebook.
Oh, does it?
Mine does. Mine says that, yeah.
Okay. I don't know why. There we go. It's on now.
It's on now. Okay.
Yeah. So let me get back to our window. Okay. Wonderful. I'm Shelley Haynes. This is Psychology Social Hour hosted by the St. Joseph Museums. Thank you for tuning in, whether you're on Zoom or Facebook. I have a disclaimer to read before I introduce our guest. This free virtual series features an educational program on a topic of mental health. This event is free for generalized information and is in no way a form of diagnosis. Please consult with your doctor or therapist for specific medical or psychological advice. We are merely starting the discussion to help destigmatize mental health. Mental illnesses, symptoms, diagnosis, and treatment methods are all a highly individualized process. With that, I would like to introduce to you Ms. Lydia Kang. She is a physician and author of multiple books, one of which she will be speaking about tonight, Quackery, The Worst Ways to Cure Everything is the title of it. And with that, Lydia, I'll let you have it.
Okay. Hello, everybody, and good evening. Thanks for having me here. As I have already warned people ahead of time, my dogs are going to be jumping in and out of the screen. This one's right here. This is Sawyer. Say hi. He's a little nervous and he likes to jump on my lap when I work all the time. And this is one of my major workplaces. So you'll be seeing him a lot. And I'm going to start off by, that's the other dog. Apologies for that. So I'm going to start off by just telling you a little bit about myself. I am a physician and a writer. I'm in Omaha, Nebraska, and I practice internal medicine at the Nebraska Medicine or University of Nebraska Medical Center. I've been in Omaha for about, I think, 18 years now. And I practice internal medicine primary care, which means I'm the person who tells people to go get their mammograms and, get their vaccines. And when they're not feeling well, I try to figure out what's wrong with them. So that's my job. About, I want to say 15 years ago, I started writing. So I had already been a doctor for 10 years or something like that. And about 15 years ago, I started writing things like essays about patient care. That turned into writing some poetry also about patient care. And then after that, I sort of took a leap of faith and started writing novels. I write young adult novels, and that is sort of where I started. My first book is called Control, and it was published in 2013, followed by Catalyst. After that, I had a couple more young adult books that were published. And then in 2017, Quackery was published with my friend Nate Peterson. Since then, I've also gone on to publish historical fiction and some more nonfiction, Patient Zero, and I've also been writing within the Star Wars universe for Lucasfilm. So that's been really fun. It's been a bit of a left turn, and I write a little bit of everything because I find everything pretty interesting, basically. So a little story about how Quackery actually happens. So I had been writing young adult, like I'd said, and one of the authors that I knew, our books both came out at the same time. Her name was April Tuholke, and she, I apologize for the dog. So she, her book and my book came out at the same time, and so we were going to several conferences together, and I met her husband, Nate Peterson. And at one point in time, we were all sitting together, and she looked at us both because Nate is a librarian and a historian, and I'm a doctor. And so she looked at us and she's like, "You guys should write some weird, interesting kind of history of medicine book together because you both have an interest in history. And Lydia, you have the medical background, and Nate has this historical, this historian background." And we kind of laughed it off and didn't think much of it. And then a couple months later, Nate emailed me and said, "Why don't we write a book about quack doctors, quack people who used to just fool people with all these weird, treatments in the past?" And I thought about it, and I thought that was like such a great idea. And one of the reasons why I found it so fascinating is because when you go to medical school, which is 4 years of really, really intense training, you don't really learn about the history of medicine. You spend every waking minute and hour of those 4 years trying to figure out how to take good care of patients. But in the process, there's no room for history. Like there's so much you have to cram in about every discipline and all the newest, latest everything and pharmacology and pathology and microbiology. It's so much that there's no room for history. And so I realized that this was an opportunity for me to learn history of medicine stuff that I hadn't gotten a chance to learn in like my training or in medical school. So that's how Quackery came to be. I get a lot of questions about how we wrote it because we are a 2-person team. I think a lot of people think that Nate writes it and then I'm the fact checker because I'm the doctor, but actually we split the book up completely 50-50. So what we did was we wrote down a bunch of different chapters that we thought would be really interesting. And so if you look in the contents of the book, you see like, there's all these different things like, leeches, cannibalism, corpse medicine, electricity, opiates, strychnine, tobacco. And Nate and I just sat down with a list and we fought over what we were going to write. Right. So Nate was like, well, I'm kind of really interested in beer. So I'm going to write the chapter on alcohol. And I said, well, I've been fascinated by mercury my whole life. I want to write the chapter on mercury. And so we just split them up, wrote the whole chapters and then exchanged them just to sort of fact check and go back and forth. And that's how we ended up writing the book. I did find that I took ones that were a little bit more heavily medical. When we wrote Patient Zero, for example, some of them were very, very intensely researched as far as like, needing to look up medical journals and papers to get all the data right. And so I tended to take those and Nate would tend to take the ones that were more history based. So that's how the book happened. It took us a little over a year to write it and then yet another year to sort of revise it and, get the book together. But we're really happy with how it turned out. And it's just a particularly beautiful book, I think, with all the pictures and everything. This is the first chapter, Mercury, which I think is pretty apt to start with because it's the first chapter that I wrote in the book. And as I had said, like when we were divvying up the chapters, I was like, I want Mercury because I find Mercury really interesting. So I thought for tonight, I don't really have a formalized talk ready for you guys. I thought that I could kind of casually go through the book and pick out some different stories or subject matters and just sort of talk about them and what it was like to research them and the fun things that I thought were really interesting that I learned in going through, so many different topics. And so we're going to start with Mercury because it is one of my favorite chapters and it is the first chapter that I wrote. So I don't know if you guys, I don't have a little, one of those widgets here where we can do a vote or anything, but I'm guessing that many people in the audience remember a time when you were sick, you had somebody give you a mercury thermometer to check your temperature. So I am that old too. When I was sick, my mom put a thermometer in my mouth and, the little the mercury would expand with heat and you would see that little silver line just move up that glass thermometer. And if you weren't careful, you broke the thermometer, which I did once because out of curiosity, I thought it would be interesting to hold a thermometer up to a light bulb and see what happened. And really what I wanted to see was I wanted to see the mercury thing go like really fast up the glass thermometer. It went a little too fast. The thing popped and then there was mercury spilled all over the floor. And like any other kid of the 1970s or 80s, I played with the mercury. I was like, oh, look at the balls of, liquid metal. I mean, it's a really fascinating element. It is the only metallic element that's liquid at room temperature. And it's it's a kind of a magical thing. So yeah, I used to play with elemental mercury as a child when I broke my thermometers. But mercury, interestingly, has been around for a really, really long time and has been used for a medication for a really long time. So one of the types of mercury that were used in the past was something called calomel, which I know sounds a lot like calamine and also sounds a lot like caramel. It has nothing to do with either. But it comes from the Greek words for good and black. And part of the reason why they think this mercury salt was named calomel was because if you ate it, it would give you horrible diarrhea, and your, sort of what would come out the other end would be very dark colored. It might be kind of black. And that was actually supposed to be a good thing, because mercury was actually thought to purge all these really bad things out of your body. And I have to back up just a little bit, because there's an entire theory behind how the body worked that existed for many millennia, and that was humoral theories, which many of you may have heard of. So there were the four humors: black bile, yellow bile, blood, and phlegm. So those four humors were thought to really orchestrate how the body worked. Everybody had the four humors. Sometimes people had one more than other, and that would give them a particular personality associated with that humor. So if you had more phlegm, you were phlegmatic. If you had more blood, you were sanguine or sort of happy, that sort of a thing. But also, in addition to sort of personalities, and like things like weather and dry, wet, things like that were also associated with the humors, in the seasons, that sort of thing. But illnesses were also associated with the humors. So for example, if you had a fever, it was thought that you had a little too much of one humor. And so for hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years, people thought, well, in order to make people feel better, we need to balance the humors out. And more often than not, it was thought that, well, I'm going to get into this bit later, but oftentimes it was thought that there was too much blood, and that was the cause of the illness. And so that's why bleeding people are doing phlebotomy, or you've probably seen in all those old movies where, there's a terribly sick woman and she's got a fever. This is like, there's a scene in Sense and Sensibility, Jane Austen's Sense and Sensibility, the movie version, where, the sister's really sick and she's getting blood, like, cut, from her arm and into a bowl, and it's getting poured out, and that's supposed to like make the fever go away. Well, black bile was also one of those humors that thought if you had too much of it, you would get rid of it. And the best way to get rid of it was calomel. You eat it, it causes massive amounts of diarrhea. And this black stuff that's coming out of you, they're thinking like it's purging the black bile, so that must be making you better. Now, the problem with that is that mercury is poisonous. So elemental mercury, interestingly, isn't quite as poisonous as the mercury salts. So if you eat the liquid mercury, you might get a little sick, but it's not the same as certain types of mercury that are incredibly poisonous. So the salt versions, like calomel and certain types of mercury salts, are really poisonous because you absorb them better in the salt form. Vaporized mercury, and so sometimes people would actually make they would heat mercury up until it was like vaporized, and they would breathe it in. That's incredibly dangerous. And there's also a form called methyl mercury, which is an organic mercury. So everything I'm talking about are these salts, but organic mercury, methyl mercury, is highly, highly poisonous. And actually there was this horrible story about this Dartmouth professor who was working with methyl mercury in the lab. And I think like a drop touched her glove, and it went through her glove, because methyl mercury will go through your gloves. And she died within weeks just from that one drop of methyl mercury. So there are lots of different types of mercury that can be very, very poisonous. Obviously, we don't like it in water. We don't, don't want it in our fish. Eating low mercury fish is probably a good thing, which is why they say not to eat too many of those deep sea, really fatty fish, because of higher mercury levels. But in any case, people would take mercury all the time. And some of the things that they use it for curing syphilis was a really classic one. So syphilis was around for many, many centuries, and probably beyond. And for some reason, mercury was like a medication of choice for treating syphilis. And they would do it by drinking the salts. They would apply the salts to the sores that they would have on their body. And then I have a great picture here where, oh, these poor guys. So you can see in this picture, this person has like syphilis sores all over his body. This person is getting mercury salts, and he's eating so much that he's getting mercury toxicity to the point where he's just vomiting like into this little container here. And then there is right here, this little fellow with his head sticking out of this barrel. And this person is getting an aerosolized, like basically a steam bath of mercury vapor. So these are all different ways that, people used to treat syphilis way back when. We obviously figured out with the onset of germ theory in the late 1800s that there were germs that were causing some of these diseases and that antibiotics would actually cure them. So with the onset of more modern understanding of how the human body worked, meaning humoral theory got thrown out the door because it was like, it just didn't make any sense. People understand how the different organs worked. They learned more about them. All of the stuff with treatments that involved humoral theory just stopped happening kind of between, I would say, the mid 1800s into the early 1900s, because mercury was still being used, I think, in the early 1900s, but fairly soon it just sort of kind of disappeared from use because people realized it wasn't terribly helpful. This is a really funny story. I know I'm still talking about mercury, I'm sorry, but I'm going to talk about this one last story because I think it's really funny. This one is about the Lewis and Clark mission that happens way back when. You guys have probably already heard about the expedition. So when Lewis and Clark decided that they were going to go across the country and try to just, head all the way over to the West Coast, they had consulted Benjamin Rush, who is one of the founding fathers, who was a physician. And Dr. Rush was a huge proponent of calomel or mercury type medications. He was convinced that if you he was really into pretty aggressive purging and bleeding. So bleeding, like I had told you about, for the, excesses of the blood humor, and the purging via calomel for too much of the black humors. And Benjamin Rush liked to really push it pretty far and use so much on people that his other fellow physicians actually called him a quack because they thought he did too much. There's my other dog, don't mind her. So he consulted on Lewis and Clark's mission before they went, and he was like, you need to bring my thunderclappers, which are his own sort of proprietary, yes, they were called thunderclappers, which when you imagine what's happening in the bathroom or in the latrine or whatever, that's an apt name. So they brought like 600 of Dr. Rush's, they were also called Thunderbolts, which are just terrible names for this like diarrhea pill. So they brought 600 of these pills on their mission. And basically Dr. Rush said, anytime you feel sick, just take a pill. It'll take care of the problem, because there's so many different illnesses that they might sort of encounter as they traveled across the country. And so anytime they felt off, they said, take a pill and just purge it out. Most of the areas where Lewis and Clark went, like it's pretty clear the path that they took across the United States. It's all over the map. But where their actual camping sites were a little bit less clear historically. And so there was this one campsite that they thought they were kind of close to figuring out exactly where they camped. And the reason why they figured it out was I think they basically found like a kitchen area, and they were able to like sort of carbon date some of the stuff in the campfire. And because Lewis and Clark the expedition was a military expedition, they were using something called the Blue Book, which was a bunch of rules that all the military had to use for their expeditions. And according to the Blue Book, you had to place your latrines exactly 300 feet from the camping area. So when they carbon dated where the camping eating area was, they sort of started sampling 300 feet around that. And they started finding all of these deposits of mercury from the poop pills. And that's how they figured out, I think it's Yolo, Montana is where this particular campsite was, but Lolo, Montana. So that's how they found out, they were able to locate the precise area of a camping site for Lewis and Clark was from the mercury poop pill. So I thought that was a very interesting little bit of history. Okay, one last thing, if you want to, regarding mercury, if you want to really impress your friends with a little bit of medical knowledge. So you guys have probably seen, like, outside of hospitals or out on the side of an ambulance or something, there's a symbol for doctors that is like, you know, the snake and the rod. You guys have probably seen that, right? Okay. So for the longest time, people thought that the sign for, you know, the medical sign was a single rod that had two snakes around it, right? So the two snakes are kind of going like this around the rod. And here's a little, I don't know if you can see that, but you can kind of see this rod right there, right? It's got the wings at the top, the rod, and it's got the two snakes around it. So that actually is the wrong rod. That is actually the symbol for the god Mercury, and it's called the caduceus. And what happened was in 1902, the US Army Medical Corps wanted to adopt that symbol, the symbol for, you know, medicine, and they snagged that picture and they put it on the icon for the US Army Medical Corps, but it's the wrong one. So what they actually were supposed to do was they were supposed to do the rod of Asclepius. I wish I could show you a picture of it, but it's basically a single rod with one snake on it. And so most medical establishments that are legitimate medical establishments and have a symbol like that, if you look really carefully, you'll see a single snake on it. So I went to NYU Medical School. If you look at the NYU Medical School website, you'll see the symbol and it'll have a single rod with one snake on it. So the rod, the caduceus, so that's the rod of Asclepius. And Asclepius was a Greek god that was the patron of health and healing. That's the correct symbol. The incorrect symbol is Mercury symbol, which is the caduceus with the two snakes. And Mercury is the patron of commerce. And he was basically like here we go. He's the god of financial gain, commerce, thieves, and trickery, which is really not what you want to use to represent a medical establishment that's trying to heal people. So once in a while, you might drive around and you might see the rod that has the two snakes. It is the wrong one. And that means that whoever designed that did not do their research very well. So it's kind of funny because I still see it around sometimes and I sort of laugh and I'm like, that's wrong. And I know exactly why that's wrong. But that all comes down to the god Mercury, interestingly. So it's just sort of like a little end note to that chapter, which I found really, really fascinating. So yeah, caduceus wrong, rod of Asclepius correct. So let's see. What else can we talk about? The next chapter is on antimony. The next chapter after that is arsenic. Arsenic was a really fascinating chapter to write. I also wrote this one as well. Everybody probably knows arsenic's a poison. For the longest time, it was called the king of poisons, the poison of kings, and it was also called inheritance powder because people would use it to poison, you know, their parents or whoever was the king or queen or something like that so that they could get next in line. Arsenic was a really clever poison to use because it didn't taste like a whole lot of anything. And the main symptom was like vomiting and diarrhea. You just felt really sick, like you had food poisoning. So you could imagine that in the days before refrigeration and preservatives and things like that, like people probably got sick from bad food a lot. And so it wouldn't be unusual for somebody to eat a big meal and then just really feel sick afterwards. And then next thing you know, they just throwing up so much and their stomach is just doing horrible things and then they die. So arsenic was a kind of a great poison to use way back when. Nowadays, it's easier to track down. So one doesn't do that as much these days. It's really unusual to hear about arsenic poisonings. They do happen, but now toxicologists know how to look for it. So there was a period of time where people thought that arsenic actually made you prettier. And by that, it was because they thought it made your skin look paler and more like a milkmaid. And so arsenic was actually used for certain like cosmetics, which is bad because over time it actually would do the reverse, not make you look pretty, but actually make you really sick and pale and make your skin look kind of weird and kind of yellowish, that sort of thing. Arsenic was also used to make certain kinds of colorants, like green colorants. And so for a long time, there were wallpapers, really beautiful wallpapers that were made of these pigments called like Paris green and Scheele's green. And people would actually get arsenic poisoning from living in these rooms that were wallpapered with arsenic wallpaper, which I think is pretty fascinating. There is a theory that Napoleon died from arsenic poisoning because he lived in places that had a ton of arsenic in the wallpaper. I think it's a pretty lightweight theory, but it is a theory because I think they did find arsenic in his hair. But people used arsenic in like tonics and solutions, and so people might have been drinking arsenic just for health, and might have gotten into their system. So it's not really clear if that's actually what killed him. But it's possible that he was getting sort of slightly poisoned from his wallpaper, which is kind of an awful thought. Interestingly, arsenic was used for a very short period of time to make an antibiotic for syphilis. Remember how we were talking about syphilis? It's not anymore, but the original early 1900s first antibiotics that came out that were really effective against syphilis were arsenicals, which is kind of neat. All right, let's see. Next chapter is on gold. I'm going to flip to something a little bit more weird, as if this isn't weird enough, but all right. I'm going to talk a little bit about cannibalism and corpse medicine, which was really probably one of the funnest chapters to write because it was so far out there. So there was a period of time when people believed that there was something in human beings, call it an essence or something like that, that could be given to somebody else in order to impart health. So a really classic example of this would be, you've heard of gladiators. After a big fight and the gladiators took each other down, people would rush over and try to drink the blood of a freshly slayed gladiator or eat their liver because they're big, strong, virile, specimens of humans, and people wanted like that energy to try to cure whatever ills they had, oftentimes things like epilepsy. In the 1700s, in the beginning of the chapter, I actually bring up a real example. In 1758, there's a young man who's being executed in London, and he's being hung. And the second that he dies from the hanging, people went up to the hanging body and tried to rub his, dead hand on like a child's arm where they had some boils to see if that freshly dead person could, like, just by touching it would like cure the skin condition that the child had. But that was not an unusual thing because, again, it was thought that these young people who were freshly killed still had this like life energy that could be imparted by touching somebody or consuming them. So for a period of time, there were many different types of human products that were available to treat people. So for example, those executioners we talked about, they actually were in a little bit of a business of, after the body was taken down, sometimes they would harvest the fat off of that dead body and turn it into something called man's grease or oil of human fat. And that grease would be rubbed into, rheumatic joints and scars and other things. Here is a picture of one of those old-fashioned apothecary jars, and they are holding basically human fat. And again, once it's just this thought that maybe it could cure things. People believe that if they found like a rotting skull and it had moss on it, that moss could somehow cure things like bloody noses. And a really popular treatment in the 18th century, so we're talking about the 1700s, was Egyptian mummies. So what happened was people would basically steal and plunder Egyptian mummies and ship them off to London or England, grind them up, and then put them into these apothecary jars. And this product was called mumia or mummia. And they were created into like poultices. They were supposed to heal snake bites, syphilitic sores, headaches, jaundice, joint pain, epilepsy. And people thought in 1585, one of the most famous royal surgeons at the time in France, Ambrose Paré, he called it the first and last medicine of almost all our practitioners. And here is a picture of a mummia apothecary jar holding powdered mummy. It's funny that this book is called Quackery, because way back then there was a whole fear that you like, were you actually getting real Egyptian mummy or were you getting fake Egyptian mummy? Like, was that quack Egyptian mummy or the real thing? Because it was hard to get, you had to go get this from like shipped over from Egypt, and it was expensive and there was a limited quantity. So sometimes people would just take like a dead body and burn it up and crumble it up and sell it as fake mummy. But it's so people would talk a lot about are you getting the real stuff? Are you getting like the it says there's actually like instructions on how to purchase the mummy, the mumia. It says choose what is of a shining black, not full of bones and dirt, and of a good smell. So that's apparently how you're supposed to shop properly for mumia, which is not so great. Let's go over to, let's see. I'm skipping over some of the ones that Nate did because he knows them better than I do. Cautery and blistering. Oh gosh, we can talk about lobotomies. That's an interesting one. So, and you guys have a really great display with some very, very informative stuff about lobotomy. So hopefully this isn't too repetitive for you guys, but I actually didn't know a whole lot about lobotomy when I started to research this book. I know it had something to do with like ice picks, and I knew it had something to do with making people just sort of like become kind of like human zombies after they had it done, but I didn't really understand it. And what I didn't also know was that the history of brain surgery or just doing something to the skull to access the brain actually has gone on for a really, really long time. And so there is some evidence that from Mesolithic times, like as far back as 8,000 to 10,000 BC, there was brain surgery being done. They have found these Mesolithic skulls with holes in them, and they're clearly not like, oh, they like fell on something and chipped a piece of, like, they're very clearly holes cut into the brain. And so there is some thought that back then it might have been because maybe due to head trauma and brain swelling, they figured if they could sort of release some of the pressure, that might help. And around, like, I'm going to sort of skip quite a bit, but probably around like the 1500s and slightly later than that, people started to do more trepanning, where they would drill into the head to try to fix all these problems. And they didn't go very well because the death rates were really high because of infection and things like that. But they were used to try to cure things like epilepsy or anything that was sort of wrong with somebody's mental health, because they had figured out that maybe the seat of cognition was in the brain, which was fairly forward thinking, because in prior times they thought there were other places in the body. But it wasn't until maybe the turn of the last century that there was some thought that somehow doing some sort of cutting of the brain might actually cure, mental health problems. And so one of the really landmark things that happened for in the realm of neurology and understanding how the brain worked all occurred due to an accident in the mid 1800s. So there was this gentleman named Phineas Gage. This is a really, really famous story. And I believe you guys have a sample skull of his in your museum. You should check it out. It's really something. I took a picture of it because it was a great replica. But the story of Phineas Gage is that he worked for this railroad company, and his job was to, I think he was a manager on site, but his job was also to tamp down the explosives in rock so that they could blow up these big chunks of rock and actually make way for the railroad ties that had to be flat, because you don't want, for a train to go fast, you want it on very level ground and going straight. You don't want it to have it to go up hills and go around curves and things like that. So they were blowing up a lot of rock to do this. And so they would drill holes in the rock, drop down some like gunpowder and things like that, and very gently tamp it down with an iron. And then they would set a fuse, run away from a far safe distance, and then they would ignite that gunpowder and it would explode. So Phineas Gage's job was to sometimes tamp down these drill holes. And I believe what happened was he was, the gunpowder was in, and he was going to very gently sort of like push that gunpowder down. And I think somebody called his name, and he was sort of doing that. And then he turned to like either hear them or say something to the person who's calling his name. And the metal rod that he was holding scraped against the side of the stone where the hole had been drilled, and probably caused a spark to happen, which ignited the gunpowder. And then that tamping iron basically became a missile and went straight through his face. So I believe it went through his cheek here, and it came out the front of his head here. I read some of the original accounts of what happened to him, because he kind of like, blew back, fell down, and people were like, oh my God, he's dead. And he wasn't. He was like, he woke up a little while later and he was able to talk. And I can't remember, but his eye was destroyed in the process. And at some point in time, I think they brought him to a local doctor. And again, he's awake and he's talking, which is just incredible to think that this thing like went through his brain. There's this one terrible scene. I really hope to God you guys aren't eating dinner, because I'm talking about so many gross things. So I deeply apologize for that. I'm going to be gross anyway. So he went to go visit the doctor. And as he was being examined, I think like Phineas Gage coughed, and the doctor was like, a teacup full of brain just like right out of his hole and just onto the floor, which apparently he didn't need that brain anymore. So the interesting thing was Phineas Gage did survive just fine, except he changed. Like his personality was just not the same anymore. He became really short with people. He was really irritable. People said that he was irreverent. He would indulge in the grossest profanity, which was really changed from the way he was before. And he said that he had the intellectual capacity of a child. So like his cognitive abilities, just sort of from a thinking standpoint, was not as good as it used to be. And somebody had quoted that he was no longer Gage, like he just wasn't the same person. And so that was incredibly helpful, I think, in the field of neurology, of understanding how the frontal lobe worked, because that was what was damaged. But the frontal lobe is also, just going way back to our talk on lobotomy, is really what was being messed with in lobotomies. So the original lobotomies were done sort of through the temples. The first practitioner who did this actually, they would cut like a little hole and drill a hole into the brain, and then they use something that looked like kind of a butter knife, and they would put that in and sort of swing it around. I think at some point in time, somebody also used something that looked a little bit like a melon baller, and it kind of churned around. Yeah, the leucotome was a metal rod, and it had a like it was a metal rod, and this like a little wire would come out, and then you could spin the wire around, so it was kind of like a melon baller, and so it would go in and sort of like melon ball your brain. But what happened was, when it became really popular in the United States, the guy that got super, super famous for the lobotomies in America, Walter Freeman, he was working with a neurosurgeon who was doing these procedures. And at some point in time, they realized, you know what, I think we could do better. Instead of going through the temple, we might be able to go through the orbital bone. So the bone that surrounds your eyeball, behind the skin here, is actually very thin. And so they figured out that they could take a long, basically an ice pick was what he kind of got his idea from. I think he was rummaging around the kitchen, was like, this could work. I don't think that he actually used the ice pick, but I think that's where he got the idea from. And they would tap it. So they would anesthetize the patient by giving them shock therapy. And then they would tap it into, I think they would go under the eyelid so it wouldn't leave a scar. And then they would tap it into this orbital bone up here, and then they would sort of swish it around. And then they would do the same thing over here with the ice pick and swish it around. Fairly soon, Walter Freeman realized he could do this without the help of a neurosurgeon. And then he kind of took a show on the road, and he became very famous for traveling all over the United States, talking to medical societies about how like this is going to just completely change the face of psychiatry, because anybody who's got any problems whatsoever, you could fix with a lobotomy. So he claimed, but there was a mortality rate with this. It was brain surgery. Some people bled to death. Oftentimes people would have the surgery and they would become kind of like vegetables, like they wouldn't be able to talk anymore, they wouldn't be able to think anymore, they were institutionalized, whereas maybe they were at home before. And it was used really improperly. So it was used on children that were misbehaving. So there's a very famous story about a young man who wrote a memoir about how he just did not get along with his stepmother, and his stepmother had him lobotomized, because he was a misbehaving child. There was nothing actually wrong with him. And he did survive, but he talked very much about that. And there were also, interestingly, more women than men underwent lobotomies, which is really, very suspect. And very famously, Rosemary Kennedy was also subjected to a lobotomy, and she was on the table when they were doing the lobotomy, and apparently they told her to like sing some songs as they were doing it, and she slowly stopped singing as the procedure was getting done, and she was pretty much institutionalized after that, which is just a really just tragic thing. So wow, I've only talked about a couple of things, and yet I have managed to take up about 45 minutes of your time. There are many, many other things in this book that were just incredibly interesting and informative for me, just as a physician, learning about how things were done in the past. Sometimes, honestly, not because people were bad, but because they didn't know how the body worked, and they were really trying their best to figure out how to make people better. So in that time, I don't think people were called quacks, because again, this was the mainstay of treatments. It's with a look back and glancing over our shoulders that we can be like, well, this stuff is really ridiculous and we would never do it now. Obviously a lot of that exists now. We're not going to get into that too much, because there's plenty in the past that we can all agree on is just a terrible, terrible idea, like radioactive tonics, things like that. So I'm going to take a pause here and see if anybody has any questions up front, about the book, how the book was made, anything like that. Happy to answer questions. So
Sarah, Max, do you have any questions or comments?
looks like no. Do we know if we
I-
have any questions on Facebook, or are we?
Um, I have not been able to determine how to, here, let me see.
Okay.
Okay, I am not seeing, I see that we have 5 people that have seen the live, but no questions
All right.
that, that I see.
Okay. Well, if anybody has any questions after the fact, I'm happy to answer them. Um, but yeah, I mean, I could talk about this stuff all day, but there's quite a bit in here. And maybe I turned everybody's stomach. I hope not.
Okay, we do have a comment from Sarah. This has been fascinating. Thank you, Lydia, for speaking with us. A lot of what you have discussed, as I mentioned before, we hopped on correlates with the Glore and giving our tours.
Yeah.
So you definitely gave elaborated information on several specific topics that we'll be able to use in our tours at the Glore.
Wonderful. I'm glad that was helpful. Yeah,
Yeah.
there's a lot in there that again overlaps with your museum, which is really wonderful. So I was just so excited to see so many of those displays there and the information that you had up there about the history behind them. It's really different to read about it. It's another thing to see actually a museum that has displays that it just makes it so much more real that way. So just you guys did such a fantastic job with the exhibits there. They're really wonderful.
Thank you. Much of that goes to the credit of George Glore, is
Oh,
who the psychiatric museum is named after. He devoted his entire career to developing those displays and exhibits.
that's
Oh, I
great.
do have a question here. Were there any subjects you researched which what didn't make it into the final book?
Yes, there is actually. So I wrote a whole chapter on phrenology, which is the study of the bumps on your head and how they dictate like what kind of job you should have or what kind of personality you have or that sort of a thing. And you've probably seen like those plaster like heads that have like the maps all over them about like what personalities lie in what parts of your brain. So that's all phrenology.
We
So
sell those in our gift shop as well.
yes, yeah, I actually want one of those really bad. I would love an original one, but I think they're kind of hard to find. So there are replicas all over the place, but
Mhm.
I would love to get an original phrenology skull by Fowler and Company, I think is the company that was really popular, that really popularized them. But in any case, the quackery is mostly about treatment and phrenology was mostly diagnostic. And so it was sort of about what's wrong with you and like, that sort of thing. And so we ended up taking the chapter out. Interestingly, I retooled that chapter into an essay for the Linden Review, which is a humanities journal that's at the University of Nebraska. So if you Google my name in phrenology, you should be able to find the essay that I wrote. And that's a little bit more of a personalized essay that is on the Linden Review website. But in our most recent book that we have coming out next year, that's going to be on sort of pseudoscience. I was able to revive the chapter for that book. So, because all of phrenology is pseudoscience, like they based it on just these assumptions. And there are a lot of relationships between those assumptions and like how certain faces mean this person's like going to be a convict or this kind of face means they're going to be like a very weak person. None of that makes any sense at all, but it's all sort of pseudoscience. So that is actually going to be in our book that's going to come out next year.
Oh, wonderful. We'll look
Yeah.
forward to getting that one as well.
Yeah, it will be really interesting. We talk about things like, oh, we talk about that. We talk about like, lie detector machines and stuff like cryptids, like Bigfoot, stuff like that. So it's a fun book.
Wonderful.
Mhm.
Well, I don't see any other questions or comments. We certainly appreciate you taking your time and going over your book and how it all came together. It's been very informative and interesting, and we will continue to sell your book because it is a very big seller in our store.
Well, thank you so much for having me here tonight, and also thanks so much for carrying the book. It's such a great fit for your for your place, all the different aspects. So it's lovely that it's got a home there. So thanks so much.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Okay, thank you, and you have a good evening.
All right, you too. Bye, everybody.
Bye-bye.